Just over 100 years ago, 5 fossilized skeletons were discovered under a narrow rocky ledge near the hamlet of Cro-Magnon in southwestern France. These Cro-Magnons, as they became known, were different from anything that had been found before. And most remarkably, scattered among the bones were hundreds of pierced seashells and animals' teeth, like beads on a necklace. It seemed to mark a whole new beginning.
Mon père a été certainement un des premiers à trouver des objets de parure. Il a soigneusement collectionné les documents qu'il a retrouvés et il les a installés dans des caisses et dans des vitrines. La préparation à la sculpture, par exemple, voici un objet sculpté dans une corne de bovidé. Il s'agit d'un phallus. Elles sont remarquables parce qu'à partir du moment où on trouve un objet comme celui-ci, on comprend tout de suite que c'est l'œuvre d'un artiste, d'un homme, destiné à une parure. Alors quelque chose de formidable, de merveilleux. C'est la technique qui ont été obtenues avec un perçoir en silex qui avait été conçu et préparé pour cet usage.
The personal ornaments unearthed by René Castanet's father were similar to other discoveries right across Europe, illustrating a remarkable explosion of invention and creativity linked to the new kinds of human being. It seemed they had walked into Europe from the southeast around 40,000 years ago. They were taller and lighter boned, and they introduced a whole new lifestyle. Their diet was richer, for example, thanks to more sophisticated weapons. Their lives were less isolated. They traveled and mixed with other tribes. They wore clothes sewn with fine bone needles, and they wore ornaments and beads fashioned from new materials.
There are more personal ornaments, for example, beads, pendants, those kinds of things, in 2 or 3 square meters here at the Abri Castanet than exist in all of human evolution everywhere on Earth prior to 35,000 years ago. So, in an evolutionary frame, it is an explosion. This object, which was first obtained by a museum at the turn of the century, was in fact compared to much later examples of fine art. And this object has every right to be in a museum alongside of some of the greatest works of art in all of human history. What is remarkable in terms of the advent of Cro-Magnons is that there is not, in fact, a gradual evolution from crude and rough and hard to distinguish to some sort of perfection in the 20th century. This kind of material exists from the very beginning. Art history goes back 35,000 years.
Some of these objects, even from quite an early stage of the Cro-Magnon modern human period, were very elaborately decorated. This is actually a fragment of a spear thrower. The lower part of the spear thrower has been lost, but you can see that it's carved into these beautiful forms of 2 reindeer following each other. They were putting this kind of investment in the tools. The tools obviously meant a lot more than just functional objects. These were important personal possessions. They're telling us something probably about the identity of the person who made them.
It's a great mistake to think that an object can be purely functional. There are always several ways of accomplishing the same thing, and we choose a particular way, and then we elaborate upon it. This is something that's characteristic of us. It's something that was not characteristic, so far as we know, of Neanderthals.
By far the most powerful expression of that extraordinary new energy and creativity is found deep underground, in hundreds of caves and tunnels beneath the mountains of France and Spain and Italy, sometimes as much as a mile from the surface. Nothing like it had ever been seen. An overwhelming abundance of life and vitality that seemed to emerge fully formed from the emptiness that had gone before.
Et dans la partie profonde, vous savez, celle où se trouve cette extraordinaire scène, eh bien, ces galeries-là sont très étroites, très difficiles d'accès. Il fallait escalader, il fallait ramper, il fallait enjamber un autre puits. Et à côté de ce puits, il a été trouvé les vestiges d'une corde. C'est d'ailleurs le plus ancien vestige de corde que l'on ait retrouvé. Donc, ces hommes étaient capables de prouesses presque spéléologiques pour aller mettre au secret peut-être le cœur du message de ces hommes.
If you imagine visiting Lascaux with a lamp or a few lamps, burning fat, flickering, with smoke and soot, and projecting light only 3 or 4 meters in front of you. And if you imagine that you are being guided into one of these caves by someone who's already been there, or perhaps even by the person who painted or engraved the animals, you can imagine that this would confer an extraordinary power on that person, and would also confer an extraordinary power on the experience as these animals with flickering light come out at you out of the darkness. These are wonderful, dramatic atmospheres for the conducting of rituals and for impressing young, fragile, vulnerable minds. Presumably these ideas were being conveyed by elders, by shamans, and the very fact that you could create an atmosphere in which these things seemed real and were frightening and were unpredictable would have given those ideas, and thereby the people who were conveying those ideas, significant credibility and authority and power.
The paintings remain a deep mystery, where they use bonding and initiation rituals to bind the group together in ceremonies that would never be forgotten, even today. Are they still retained in the collective European consciousness, in myths like Orpheus, and the ritualized fires of hell?
The people who painted Lascaux had control of certain kinds of painting techniques and drawing techniques that weren't even developed in our own Western tradition until as late as the 15th and 16th centuries, and somewhat later in some cases. Perspective drawing, for example, which is usually attributed to a much later historic period, was already clearly evident at Lascaux and was completely mastered by whoever the person was 17,000 years ago who was painting on those walls.
What caused this explosion of culture and technology? What impact did it have on the Neanderthals? The two rival theories that have attempted to unravel that mystery have unleashed some of the most bitter personal attacks ever traded by scientists. The story starts way further back in time in the Great Rift Valley that runs for thousands of miles like a giant scar across the face of Africa. As the Rift Valley itself was being created 4 or 5 million years ago, our furthest ancestors first separated off from the apes and began to walk upright. It took some 2 million years before the first primitive tools were made. Then, around 1.8 million years ago, the Great Exodus. Homo erectus, along with many other animals, moved north and began to colonize Asia and Europe. The accepted view has been that all the races of the world trace their origins back to that distant migration. But in the 1980s, the received wisdom was powerfully challenged by the replacement theory. It argues that there was a second wave, a small group of people who appeared only 200,000 years ago, and went on to sweep aside all the peoples that existed at that time and become us. They too came out of Africa. This radical interpretation was developed by Chris Stringer.
The out of Africa theory says somewhere between 100 and 150,000 years ago, our species originated in Africa, and then it spread from there to the rest of the world. And in doing so, it replaced the older lines of human evolution in the other regions. So in Europe, the line of evolution of the Neanderthals, which had been running for hundreds of thousands of years, was replaced by these newcomers from Africa. And they were different from the Neanderthals. Their skulls were shaped like ours in a modern way, higher and rounder. Their skeletons were more lightly built. Their physique was really one that was warm adapted. They looked like they've just come from a tropical or a subtropical homeland.
With its high forehead, smaller nose and projecting chin, Stringer argues that the Cro-Magnon or modern type of skull could never have evolved from the big-browed, low-domed Neanderthal skull. Milford Wollpoff utterly rejects Stringer's hypothesis. He is the most outspoken champion of the rival theory. For him, Neanderthals are not extinct. They are alive and well and all around us. They have either evolved into or merged with Cro-Magnons to become us. The key to his case is continuity. That ever since the first great exodus, 1.8 million years ago, all the races that have evolved in Asia, Africa and Europe have remained linked through continuous waves of interbreeding. So over the course of more than 1 million years, all the races have managed to keep pace with one another and so evolve simultaneously into modern people. It's called the multi-regional theory.
Out of Africa is a funny idea because on the one hand we know that everybody comes from Africa. Our species evolved in Africa, not just the hominids, but our particular species, Homo sapiens, is an African species, and we spread around the world in a series of colonizations. So, in that sense, of course, everyone understands that there is an out of Africa. The issue is what happened next. Are there another series of species, 1, 2, 3, 5, that evolved in Africa as well, each one spreading out and replacing the previous one? That's the replacement theory, or sometimes called the Eve theory. Or is there a complex net of populations that are interconnected with each other, with people leaving Africa, coming back into Africa? That's much more like the way we look at human evolution as multi-regional evolution.
In my view, the Neanderthals were a different species to our own species, Homo sapiens. There are measurements we can take on these skulls using these calipers. So we can look at the projection at the bottom of the nose, and we can take a similar measurement here to measure the projection at the top of the nose. And that very clearly distinguishes early modern people from Neanderthals.
You know, I know there are people who will point with their calipers and say, here's a Neanderthal, and here's a modern human, and there's no way one could evolve into the other. But what kind of model could we have of human evolution where a group of people could come to Europe with a new technology and simply replace the old ones? To begin with, to think that that could ever happen means that you must believe that biology and culture are linked. And if we've learned anything this century of Holocausts and racism, we must have learned that there is no link between biology and culture.
Why the out of Africa theory has sometimes been portrayed as, say, the killer African theory, we get this kind of thing coming through, or that in some way, you know, replacing the Neanderthals is in some way like a racist thing, you know, treating them as an inferior race that's wiped out and supplanted. I don't see that. People who've worked on fossils for many years and have developed interpretations, it's very difficult for them to actually give up those interpretations and say, I was completely wrong. And I think so the debate gets very personalised. We are dealing with areas where there are many uncertainties. We don't have enough fossils. We don't have evidence from many parts of the world of what was happening. So there are still lots of areas where you can propose almost anything you want for what was happening in human evolution.
What you're looking at is a little longer skull or a little shorter skull, a little higher skull, maybe a little more domed or a little more pentagonal, slightly bigger brow ridges, a more receding chin. But how much is enough? It's not like Neanderthals have 6 fingers or 3 ears. If they did, it would be easy. You'd count them, you'd know who you had. You're looking at fine gradations of difference that are very difficult to be extremely clear about.
The debate has become so embittered that Stringer and Wollpoff now find it hard to speak to each other. But slowly, steadily, the pieces of the jigsaw are coming together, seeming to support Stringer's remarkable replacement theory. From America, for example, scientists can now show that modern people cannot have originated from a cold climate. A brilliant piece of research has established what they call a limb thermometer, based on the fact that in hot climates, bodies evolve long arms and legs to dissipate heat. In cold climates, bodies become short and stocky. When this thermometer is applied to Neanderthals, it shows typical cold adaptation over thousands of years, very short limbs. Cro-Magnon fossils, on the other hand, show no signs of cold adaptation. They have the longer limbs from a tropical origin. And modern people have retained those Cro-Magnon features. Our limbs are too long for a cold climate. Another piece of the jigsaw comes from much closer to the African origin. It's now clear that Israel's historic position as a crossroads of culture stretches back beyond Islam or Christianity or even Judaism. In the distant age of Neanderthals, as the new African people were coming north, paradoxically, the deepening ice age in Europe drove the Neanderthals south into a landscape that was comfortingly similar to to the one they had left behind.
Israel is really the crux. It's this sort of pressure cooker, because you have in this very small space that joins the two great land masses that represent the different geographical range of Neanderthals in Eurasia and the early moderns in Africa. You have them coming together. You have some kind of traffic going on. Now, what was going on, we're not sure, but we do know that apparently they were either coexisting or sharing that landscape back and forth, that little narrow strip, for tens of thousands of years.
The fundamental question is, who was here first? Back between the wars, Englishwoman Dorothy Garrod was the pioneer who excavated in the stark hills behind Tel Aviv. She discovered both Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon remains. They were assumed to fit the comfortable, established chronology. Neanderthals dated at around 60,000 years old, and Cro-Magnon fossils at around 40,000 years. But some archaeologists working in Israel were not convinced. They believed that the stratification in the caves had been disturbed by underground water flows. So they searched around for another dating method.
We were looking for new dating techniques because radiocarbon technique, which was available at the time, was no good beyond 40,000 years. And therefore we needed techniques that can date much earlier layers.
The new dating technique was a stroke of genius. It was based on the fossil bones of small rats and mice. African rats migrated north at times of extreme heat. European hamsters came south during the ice ages. Archaeologists know the dates of those climate changes, and it gave them an accurate timescale for dating the human fossils found alongside the rodent bones.
These are rodent bones that were found while sieving carefully the dirt from the cave. These are the remains of an owl pellets. So owls hunt these rodents, digest them, and then throw up. These bones are different from other rodent bones that are found in different layers, different periods. So by looking and identifying the exact species of the mice that the owls hunted, it seemed to us that such a change could have happened only at the beginning of the last glaciation, somewhere between 100 and 80,000 years ago. The oldest rodent bones clearly indicated that anatomically modern humans are earlier than the Neanderthals in the country.
The new date was startling. It meant that the modern-looking fossils were in fact 100,000 years old. Neanderthals about 60,000 years. On that evidence, Cro-Magnons could not have evolved from Neanderthals. They had to represent a new wave out of Africa.
They've really turned around our understanding of the relationship between Neanderthals and modern humans. With the new dating techniques applied, these fellows here, they're thought to be 40,000 years old, are actually down here, 100,000 years old. Now, if they're older than the Neanderthals at 60, how can they be their descendants? It's like saying that your child is your grandmother. It can't be.
The Israeli evidence has swung the scales heavily in favor of Stringer's idea of a recent exodus, but it hasn't killed off the debate.
One of the more recently published ideas is that maybe people lived side by side, different races, but never interbred. I am incredulous about this. After all, most of the big Israeli samples, where there's several specimens, show that there's features from the so-called different races all mixed together, very much like when we find hybridized populations today. When we talk about races as dividing and merging, Israel's a case of merging.
Hybrid populations or out of Africa, the bones alone can't resolve it. Everybody was looking for a conclusive evidence, a more objective, more absolute clock to measure the passage of time. It was to come from a most unexpected quarter.